Hi everyone, today I'm bringing you the first interview of this channel. This first interview had to be with my professor, Richard Shapiro. Richard has been a researcher of Michel Foucault for a long time. He was a student of Michel Foucault in Paris at Collège de France in the early 80s. And he has been studying and researching and teaching on Foucault's work since then. I was fortunate enough to be a student of Richard Shapiro for many, many years. Richard offers a unique perspective, a unique way of interpreting, but more than that, of paying homage to Foucault's work, precisely by making it useful to us today. He has been writing a book on Foucault and Christianity for many years now, and I really look forward to reading it soon. I won't go on and on over his curriculum. I left a link to his website where you can see his curriculum there. So without further ado, let's listen to this great teacher of Foucault's impact in the world today.
Very good. It's a privilege to be invited to participate in Critique with Nietzsche Foucault. And I'm very happy that Rodrigo has undertaken this project and requested my participation. What I'd like to do is begin by setting a context. Well, I guess first I'll introduce myself a bit, and then set a context for what I'll address. So I'm an anthropologist, an educator. I've had a long career in building academic programs and in teaching within them. The focus has always been on how critical social thought can facilitate thinking that affects the worlds that we're living in, that addresses issues of injustice and inequality and domination and exploitation and alienation and normalization and all these various ways that people are kept in places that limit them, and how different traditions of critical thought can help us expand our capacity to think, but also expand our capacity to imagine new realities, to interact with each other in different ways, to develop new relational capacities. So basically I see teaching and paying homage to thought through our own work as something that helps facilitate capacity building for all of us in emotional, affective development, in cognitive development, in our imagination, in our capacity to think critically, and our capacity to act effectively and strategically. And so Foucault is, of course, to me, one of the key thinkers that enables us to experiment with thought in ways that expand possibilities for human freedom, expand possibilities for creating different ways of being in the world that are more joyful, more just, more affirmative of diverse ways of being that facilitate healing ourselves and the planet that we live in. So Foucault is someone I was very fortunate to know personally. He, of course, as you know, passed away in 1984. But at that point, I had already met him first in New York when I was a graduate student at the New School for Social Research in Anthropology. And Foucault was invited to give a seminar at New York University, at NYU, through the French department that was headed by Richard Sennett, who himself is a very interesting thinker and has done very exciting work in many areas. And so, although I was a student at the New School, I was invited to participate in his seminar at NYU. And that was my first encounter with him. And the seminar was on sexuality and solitude. And it involved work that is now, I think, most present in the Posthumous Volume 4 of the History of Sexuality, that has recently come out in French, and that is coming out in English, at least according to the press release, I think in January of 2021. So while I do read French and was forced to read volume 2 of the History of Sexuality in French because I couldn't wait till it came out in English, I understand things much better and much quicker when they're written in English. So I'm very much looking forward to volume 4 coming out. And so in this, after the seminar, I was then just completing my master's and went to Paris and ended up following some of his courses at the Collège de France. And that's a wonderful institution in Paris where intellectuals give seminars that are free and open to the public. It's an institution that does not provide degrees. It's there for public knowledge and public learning. And of course, his seminars were overflowing, and they would have people sitting outside looking at the seminar on video. But I would always get there in time to find a seat. So he was giving those seminars. Then I went back to New York, completed my doctoral coursework, and moved again to Paris. And lived there for a little over a year, from May of '83 to June of '84, which is when he passed away. And he was ill then, but he was working, and he was able to sometimes see people. So I was still able to have some time meeting with him, and just as he was doing his work. And I actually think he lived as long as he did because of his commitment to complete volumes 2 and 3, which is what he did during that last year. And volume 4 was not something that he wanted published. Actually, he made it very clear that he wanted no posthumous publications. But his partner, himself an anthropologist, Danielle Defer, because so many of Foucault's works are in the public realm, because they were taped and then those tapes were transcribed and they were distributed, that led to first the decision to publish all of his courses at the Collège de France. So Paul Grave Macmillan has published all of his courses. I believe it's 11 volumes or so, 11 years of courses. I've checked that before saying exactly that's what it is. But anyway, in fascinating courses, brilliant thinking that cover, basically all of the topics that interested him. They decided to publish those and make sure that they could do them accurately and with proper commentary and compare and fill in gaps by looking at Foucault's notes. And then they decided to do the same with volume 4 of the History of Sexuality. They decided that because so much of it is out in the public realm, let's just make this another volume that has experts in his thought and people with access to his notes. There's the Centre Michel Foucault in Paris, and scholars can access Foucault's notes there. So they thought we may as well put this out as a definitive edition and have this be the basis for people who wish to delve more fully into his thought on the history of sexuality. And so volume 4 is Confessions of the Flesh, which really, he joked once, he said my Christian book, and then he meant, no, I mean my book on Christianity. I think it's fair to say that none of Foucault's books would qualify as Christian books, at least by official church authorities. So after actually he died, I came back to the United States, and I began teaching at a now defunct institution called New College of California, helped develop a humanities program there, then went on to teach at another institution where I met Rodrigo. Foucault's thought has always been crucial to how I viewed the world, even as many other critical traditions have also been very alive for me, the Frankfurt School, Derrida and deconstruction, post-colonial thought and thinkers like Spivak, certainly various critical, feminisms, critical race theory, queer theory, all sorts of traditions of thought. And all of those, however, also are quite indebted to Foucault. So his thought, even where they are critical of some aspects of his thought, or they don't see that he sufficiently addressed certain things, his approach, his critical concepts have all been very much alive. And I think all of these traditions that are interested in understanding the present and impacting the present and creating social change that creates a freer and more equitable and more creative and more interesting world.
Yeah, let me interrupt you there. One of the greatest critiques of Foucault is that his books are not activist enough. But then you're telling us that his work was connected to all of these social movements, gave space to thought for all these movements. How can we think of that?
On the one hand, there's Foucault's own statements on this, which is that he wanted his work to be of use and to be something that certainly he had very high scholarly standards and was someone who did love, as he would say, dusty archives and poring over obscure materials and trying to understand things through very rigorous research and open new ways of thinking about the past that impacts the present, because that was his approach. The history of the present is to start with questions and related to the present and pose questions to the past based on those questions, to look at differences in our present that are both hold possibilities and reveal constraints, and use an examination of differences in the past to illuminate the difference that is our time and that is our reality. So he wanted his work to be used, and he wanted, I can tell you a quick story. I know Janice Sawicki, who wrote a very interesting book on feminism and Foucault called Disciplining Foucault. He met her at one point and said, "So what are you working on?" I think because the book was based on her dissertation. And she said, "Oh, I'm writing about your work." And he said, "I don't understand why I should be written about. I can understand how you might want to say, here's what in my work helps you think something that matters to you in the world." So he wasn't comfortable being somehow an authoritative intellectual figure where it was enough to simply debate his work. He was also part of an experiment where people in France wrote without signing their work. And so, because he thought, and he was someone who helped develop this idea, because he did not want people to read what he had to say already with a sense of, oh, I know Foucault, I know what he's going to say, or I know what I like about him, I know what I don't like about him, or I better take it seriously because it's Michel Foucault who wrote it. I wouldn't take it seriously if it just said anonymous, or if it said, Mike Franklin or whatever, So he very much, and that's another reason I think that he avoided or continually refused whatever scholarly labels were attached to him. So he was called a structuralist, a post-structuralist, a crypto-Marxist, an anarchist, a nihilist. He was called various things, and he never entered into the conversation about any of those, except to say that his work is what was important to examine, and that perhaps labeling his work was a way to avoid a serious engagement with the work. That if you could say, oh, he's a post-structuralist and post-structuralists think this and I disagree with that, or he's a post-structuralist and I love post-structuralism and that's great, now I know that he's somebody I'll like. But none of that really involves grappling with his texts and grappling with the questions in the text that are relevant to our world, whether that's how we treat people labeled mentally ill, whether that's how we look at diversity related to sexual practice and identity, whether that's how we treat people who are incarcerated and how that system operates. So in all, and he also made use of his work, of his work and his voice to expand who participates in conversations about issues. So, for example, he set up a group for prisoners to speak about their own experiences, and that was activism linked to his work on prisons, discipline and punish in English, Surveiller et punir in French, but that group was not for him to be the expert. That group was for him to say, I've raised certain questions about the prisons that reveal problematic aspects of their history, problematic aspects of their current practices, and we need to hear from the people who have intimate knowledge about that. And even his method of genealogy, he defined, I'll paraphrase here, but he defined genealogy as a kind of alliance between erudite scholarship and local knowledge. So, for example, it was not that high theory should be the final word, quote unquote high theory, or erudite scholarship should tell us what we need to know and what we need to think about something. It should point to the limits of these universalist frameworks that we utilize to claim access to the totality of being or to the nature of the human being or what have you. Instead, what we should do is use scholarship to create new questions, to create greater uncertainty about truth, to expand who can participate in defining reality and defining true discourse, and that needs to intersect with local knowledge, with all of those forms of knowledge that are discredited, devalued, considered beneath the level of science or scientific rigor. And whether that's social science or human sciences, as they say in France, human sciences or natural sciences, that people's knowledge of reality needs to be a part of the conversation. And Foucault also saw local knowledge as knowledge that was often very much forged in context of struggle and including political struggle. So there was knowledge about how to respond to an oppressive reality, to a limiting reality that existed in subaltern communities, that existed in communities that had been devalued and viewed as less than, and that scholarship needed to facilitate the inclusion of their voices in how we think about things and in how we determine policy and in how we organize social movements. So Foucault very much was critical of the universalist intellectual. This was a part of his debate with Sartre, of that you sort of make proclamations about reality and then other people sort of fall in place to say, how do we put this truth into practice? Foucault, very much as a Nietzschean, wanted us to have a problematic relation to all truth claims, and certainly to be critical of the dominant will to truth that said there is a truth, we can know it, and the point of knowing it, so we can then so we can then all align ourselves with that truth. So the notion of truth that he was very critical of was, I often think of it as a kind of conversion model of truth, that there's a truth, we gain insight into what it is, and then we seek to convert all entities, including ourselves, into that truth. So how do we get things that are outside the truth to align with the truth? How do we get people who are not living according to the truth to start living according to the truth? So this conversion model, obviously it has a link to Euro-Christian legacies around the will to truth, but it also does get secularized. And so even today in this period of a pandemic, and in this period where anti-science is rampant, both in relation to the pandemic, but also in relation to climate change, which is increasingly evident in organizing people's lives. Here in California with fires, we've had in the US great floods in the Gulf. Certainly the Amazon in Brazil is something that is intimately linked not only to issues of quality of life in Brazil, but globally in terms of what the Amazon does to absorb some of the pollutants and the
CO2, yeah.
CO2 that causes global climate change. So even in this period where we have a very strong binary now about science and anti-science, Foucault wanted us to have a more nuanced understanding of truth than just what is the science, how do we all follow the science? And part of the limitation on discourse in the present is that the anti-science brigade is so obnoxious and loud and intrusive and dangerous in terms of the effects of its discourse, that there's no space for anything other than to say, of course, we're all for science. And of course, we all are for science. But if we are able to ask more subtle questions, then we'll see that actually the pandemic isn't just the pandemic. The pandemic is always mediated through political relations, through cultural practices. So for example, the pandemic in Taiwan is not what the pandemic in the US is. The pandemic in Taiwan is under control. There are cultural practices that involve mask wearing that long precede COVID. The US, it's now become a political issue whether you wear a mask or not. If you're for Trump, you don't wear a mask because he doesn't wear a mask, and maybe COVID is a hoax. Now that it's no longer a hoax, it's still something we don't have to let dominate our lives, as he has said, now that he's contracted the virus and received a level of treatment that no one else has access to. But at any rate, that even scientific truths are always organized within social contexts. They're organized within power dynamics. They're organized with cultural presuppositions and cultural practices that mediate how they're articulated and how they're received. So, we often, it's now part of popular discourse to say, COVID doesn't care who you are. COVID is a virus that will just infect anyone who puts themselves in harm's way. And yet there's some difficulty understanding that while COVID is a virus, and we want to separate its truth as a virus from its truth as its how it affects people, COVID is another vehicle for racism, for class oppression, for targeting those who are most vulnerable, for attacking people who are elderly and live in care facilities. So, so there's an effort to say, well, there's the truth of COVID, which is a medical reality, and then there's a different truth of COVID, which is our social structure. And somehow we want those to be very disparate and distinct. But yet, if we look at how COVID exists in the world, it exists without those pure distinctions. It exists as a virus and functions like a virus. And yet how it functions like a virus is inseparable from the social world in which it's circulating. And so
exactly, in the US and Brazil, poor Black people and indigenous people are the most proportionately the most affected and most the highest death rates as well.
Exactly. And so, these realities reveal that there is a different way to think about truth that is not anti-science, but that also understands that social reality impacts what scientific truth, not only what it means, but what it is. The scientific truth of COVID is that it functions in ways that not only reveal, but strengthen the inequalities and disparities that already structure US society. Just another thinker who's been very critical of science, Bruno Latour, critical in the sense of science is the objective truth that we now all need to align with, because what that means is also not so simple. In other words, to say, yes, we can better resist COVID by wearing masks, but what are the cultural barriers to wearing masks? Or what are, in the US, what are the political barriers to wearing masks? And why does it become a political issue? And how does that change what COVID is in our society? Because if we didn't have that approach to mask wearing, we wouldn't be in the degree of predicament that we're currently in, and many lives, some say up to maybe 90% of the 210,000 people who died in the US may have been spared if we had a government that immediately responded intelligently. And that means, yes, listening to doctors, listening to medical experts, but also listening to other levels of knowledge in communities that know what their vulnerabilities are and have been ignored in political processes, in media. Their knowledge has been ignored, which is part of why the predicament is as bad as it is for the country and for those communities. If scientific knowledge were valued as well as local knowledge, then we probably would have addressed in a more effective way the inequities that organize the society, so that people of color and indigenous people, poor people, all the people who are now called necessary workers and frontline workers, and they're the ones who are most vulnerable, and even healthcare workers. Healthcare workers at some level know that they're entering something that's quite risky, but if someone wants to deliver food from a market as their job, they're not really signing up to risk their life when they decided, when they entered that career, for whatever forces were at work in making that the career that they ended up with. But at any rate, local knowledge about vulnerabilities and about the needs within a community have clearly not been valued. If they had been valued, those communities wouldn't be as vulnerable now as they are, and the country wouldn't be as vulnerable as it is, because if we took care to listen to the knowledge in communities, local knowledge in communities, then we would have had different policies. And that would, of course, if there were structural ways for those voices to be heard, then we'd also have a different order of political governance. So governmentality would also be impacted simply through the inclusion of local knowledge as a necessary voice, a necessary space to listen to design policy, to organize the public sphere, to create an economy, etc. So it's not only scientific truth that matters in this moment, it's also truths that have been quite apparent to communities targeted for oppression on race, on class, etc., in this country for long periods of time. And fortunately, in some cases, the media is not only bringing medical experts to discuss COVID, which of course they do bring and they should bring, but it's been wonderful to also see people like Cornel West are regularly on CNN, who's a leading scholar on race and social justice, and have people who are able to speak to the social realities and to the larger social context in which COVID is wreaking havoc on people disproportionately, but on everyone in terms of shutting down life as we once assumed we could understand it to be. That life involves meeting with people and having actual physical, not simply virtual relations, etc.
You're bringing here very important uses of Michel Foucault's openings of thought and of action and of ways of looking at how culture takes shape, right? Because something that I've seen a lot during COVID now is the use of Michel Foucault's works, like the use of the thought of biopolitics or of many other issues that Foucault raises, and people are very keen to use Michel Foucault's work to almost as if to reify it, to say, you see how it can apply here. And but what I'm seeing you do now is actually expand, and is actually expanding, because yes, I see when I read Foucault, I see what you're saying, that he was opening up in his genealogy. He's opening up what's considered to be true, making that discussion open again, and so we can see how it moves and see it moving maybe, and then reflect on our world as it's moving, right? I'm always thinking of Foucault trying to make us see action, almost as if he's rejecting any stop, as like a theory that says it all and it's a final statement and we're done. But during COVID, I saw so many people use biopolitics and other ideas from Foucault to say, you see, this is how we can explain what's going on with the help of Foucault. But I see you doing something else right now. I think you're expanding. You're like, okay, thanks, Foucault. Now let me do something with this, you know? And I think, as I've heard you say before, that's what legacy means. That's what taking over somebody's legacy and paying homage to Foucault means. Because just saying, oh yes, Foucault thought all of this, but Foucault died in the 80s and COVID is now. He can't be thinking now. So we need to think for ourselves, right? We need to do the work, right? What do you think about this?
Well, I think you're precisely saying things that would make Foucault smile and laugh, and he did laugh easily, because I think what you're telling me is that by being obedient to Foucault, we need to be disobedient to Foucault. So in other words, it's not about, here's his thought, and it's a reified body, and it's a certain set of analytical tools even, or actually conclusions that we know we can reach because of how he diagnosed society. Instead, we're saying that Foucault's thought needs to be in response, certainly to his scholarship, how his scholarship helps us, but how it helps us think events, the present, social movements, problematic aspects of society, how it helps us think absences, because in the discourse that we were just having about science and local knowledge, it's pointing to an absence in the dominant discourse in the US right now around COVID, that it's about how do we obey science, but not how do we also learn from local knowledge traditions. And if we listen to both those things, we'll not only do the goal of most, which is to open society again and to open the economy again, but we'd open the economy differently, and we'd open society differently, and we'd have a different understanding of what knowledge matters and whose voices matter, and how those who've been absent do matter, not just for their well-being, but how their voices matter for the well-being of society as a whole, even as that would, excuse me, involve tremendous shifts in the organization of power relations, in the distribution of resources, but definitely that Foucault is not a grid to overlay on reality and say, okay, so let's see, normalization is an important concept. So here's what we're doing that's normalizing. Biopower is an important concept. Here's how these are just examples that prove his theory. Because Foucault didn't accept the theory-practice dichotomy. He saw his work, his scholarship, his thinking as an act. He saw thought as an act. He defined it as a perilous act because it does upset the existing order if it's done well. It does upset our own certainty. It is itself a product of our own humility and curiosity in relation to the world we're living in. So it's not an act of certainty or of arrogance or of ego. It's a surrender to the unknown and what still needs to be thought, and entering into a relation with that which is unknown, that which is mysterious, that which is problematic, that which is disturbing. And thought for Foucault shouldn't be a kind of palliative where we feel good again about ourselves and about our world. It should be something that keeps us constantly destabilized, constantly open to what else needs to be thought. And for Foucault, when he was sort of critiqued as being so critical that he must be a terribly pessimistic person, he said, it's not that I think that reality is bad or that everything is bad, but I do think that everything is dangerous. And one of the things that was most dangerous to him was our sense of certainty about what we know and what we need to do because of what we know. And because Foucault saw the ways in which these systems of truth and this universalist will to truth necessarily operated on a binary or a dualism that always identified those outside the truth that again need to be brought into the truth. So it was a very homogenizing understanding of what the ideal is. The ideal is everybody again aligned with this universal truth. And that in the process, it was tremendously violent. And he described this will to truth that we can see at play in the Inquisition, in the history of Christianity, or in the Crusades. We can see it in the history of colonialism. We can see it in the history of neoliberal systems of governmentality that are globalized. And we can see it in the backlashes that they create, but that there is a way that human beings ought to operate. There is a truth that they ought to all be obedient to. And obedience to truth is defined as what liberates human beings in this dominant narrative that Foucault is very critical of. And instead, we need a way to destabilize that, to ask questions that don't have easy answers, to enter into relations that are complex and multiple. And complexity and multiplicity are things that one would assume would be welcomed, at least in intellectual worlds, in worlds of scholarship, in institutions of higher education. And yet, I don't think I'm exaggerating to say that I don't know where thought that embraces complexity and multiplicity has found a home anywhere in the world. So that to me is it's not only sad, but it's calamitous in terms of what happens then in the world when everything becomes a kind of true false binary, a good evil binary, a right wrong binary, a normal abnormal binary, And we see that those who define themselves as the most progressive voices in society, embracing that same model of a truth that all of us need to embrace for our liberation. So this whole notion of truth, of the realization of human beings through obedience to truth, is something that all of Foucault's work questions and challenges, and not at an abstract level, but always at a precise level of what happens when this is understood as what the criminal is, what happens in the history of sexuality when knowledge power configurations begin to define sexual subjects as unique kinds of persons or that need certain kinds of social interventions. And I mean, so in a way, to segue here a bit, that we also understand true identity to be an interior truth, that if we align with that truth and we obey the truth of that, then we will be the fullest version of ourselves that we possibly can be. We will liberate ourselves by aligning ourselves with this truth of the self, which is a truth that is unchanging. It resides within us. It can be repressed and distorted and negated and denied, but our task is to constantly speak its truth and liberate ourselves by speaking that truth. So in the History of Sexuality, Volume 1, when Foucault critiques the repressive hypothesis, he's critiquing a notion of power that precisely assumes that it operates through this negation, through distorting, denying, repressing, something underneath it that's essential, that if it were allowed to fully express itself, would be would be the realization of freedom. So we live currently in a very strongly identitarian order. I don't know if it's as strong elsewhere as in the United States, but I do know that it's a global phenomenon. And in the United States, it's reaching new heights as I speak. So in other words, if my identity is X, then I am the only one who knows the truth of X. And anyone who brings a critique of any of my practices, who does not occupy my identitarian space, is oppressing me. So if, for example, and this completely misreads processes by which identity is constructed and organized. Foucault is very clear that power-knowledge configurations impose fixed identities on people. So that, for example, in the History of Sexuality, Volume 1, he talks about 4 new subjective identities that develop, or subjective positions that develop, one of which is quote-unquote pervert or homosexual. And Foucault is very clear that homosexuality went from something that was a potential within any human being, vaguely in Christian society under the category of sodomy, also wasn't particularly well defined, but just this sinful impulse that resided within everyone. It went from that to a particular kind of human being, to a particular character, to a person with particular gestures, with a particular mentality. And so Foucault is very clear that that identity is imposed by power-knowledge configurations, that it emerges out of that observation domination, to use language that's more pervasive in Discipline and Punish. So through that observation domination, you get somebody now called a homosexual. And Foucault is also very clear that that becomes a strategic space. But it's not finally understanding that there are homosexuals. It's power-knowledge configurations socially constructing homosexuality as a person, as an identity, as something that we can attach to the truth of a self. So with that attachment comes strategic space. And so Foucault is very affirmative of all of those movements that arise then to say, yes, we are what you say we are. We do engage, we do the things that you say are sinful, or we have the feelings that you say are wrong or abnormal, that need to be cured. We are that category that you've imposed upon us, but we aren't what you say we are in terms of the value of who we are, the dignity of who we are, the rights that we deserve for who we are. And so identity for Foucault exists in a social network. It exists in history, in complex power relations. And we can't be, he ends volume 1 with this irony that we've now identified ourselves as having a truth, and our liberation is coming from expressing that truth. But how can that be liberating? Because again, it's the reduction of liberation to obedience to the authority of truth. And in doing that, we miss where that truth comes from. We miss diverse experiments with what he calls bodies and pleasures at the end of volume 1 of the History of Sexuality. Rather than experimenting with bodies and pleasures, or experimenting with gender and gender performance, whatever it may be, it now becomes, here's the way to be a liberated subject as this kind of gendered being or as this kind of sexual being. And we need to police each other to ensure that we all abide by that truth of this identity. So, certainly this means that that people become increasingly intolerant of difference in the name of liberating us to be the truth, to be aligned with the truth. And I mean, within the history of sexual politics, you see this playing out around whether it's sexual practice or whether it's gender identity, or whether it's also within that, there's no space for critical reflection on how we became who we are and what we need to do to affirm diverse experiments within our community around what it is that organizes a community. And if in this case it's around sexuality, around bodies, around pleasures, but also around certain notions of what knowledge we affirm in defining those things, Foucault wants to see us get out of that trap of aligning with a true self, aligning with a true identity, and has much more of a Nietzschean notion of the artist as continually remaking oneself through creative experimentation, rather than finding a self and then being obedient to that truth for the rest of our lives. Rather, what are the practices and identities, even identity as a practice? How is identity practiced? How is truth practiced? What are we doing with identity? What are we doing with truth? What are the ways in which we're affirmative of what we're doing with truth? What are the ways we're affirmative of what we're doing with identity? And what do we find problematic in how we're utilizing truth, how we're practicing truth, how we're practicing identity? And how do we even assess that? How do we make that assessment without including other voices, without including the experiences of other people? Maybe a particular practice that's working for me only works for me because I occupy a certain privileged space around class or race or what have you. Maybe it isn't working for others. Maybe my own identity even is classed and racialized in ways that I'm universalizing, and it isn't working or it isn't resonating with people from other cultural histories, from other backgrounds, etc. So to be open to that, to the other, to be open to that difference, to be open to experiments that are perhaps valuable for us, but may also be valuable because they're valuable for others. And Foucault wants to see discourse around those experiments and their circulation and their interaction with one another as creating new kinds of community, new kinds of liberation, new practices of self that, again, are moving and are alive and are open to learning and to challenging the practices that we hold and to the way that we use truth to justify those practices. So it's a very different notion. Yeah.
Nowadays, as you said, we live in cultures, particularly in Western societies, which are where Foucault focused his studies more. We have forms of subjectivity, as you were saying, that are very tied to the construction and production of identity and of a truth, of an interior truth of the self that expresses itself, that must find a space to express itself as the truth of that self. And we see nowadays with social media, with internet, more and more spaces, the so-called social media like Facebook and Instagram and etc., where people construct identities, or they produce their ideas, and they also are fed ideas and ways of producing their own identities. And of course, there are differences among cultures, different cultures. But I remember you said once that nowadays in Western Christianized societies or secular Christian culture, we have people that came from an older culture centuries ago, 1 century or two ago, where the goal was to renounce the self. And now we see people affirming the self. And I wanted you to point out a little bit of that with regards to Foucault's work, because I think he does point to that change. But again, Foucault didn't see from the 80s until now what's happening. And what I see is that we are really living, I think we are living in a time where the affirmation of self is a public affirmation of self, and the public space that's predominant for this affirmation of self are the social media. What do you think about that?
It's a very intriguing observation question that you're making, because of course social media is about a decade old in terms of its prevalence, in society, and it's certainly becoming a key site for self-presentation and for self-affirmation. And more people experience the world as something that will be part of the presentation of self through social media. So often they're in having an experience, the issue in the experience is its presentation or representation on social media. So I go somewhere, but going somewhere is not the experience. What I really want to get out of it is how I present myself on social media when I post the images that show just how exciting my life is, or just how cool the events I go to are, or myself with people that show that I'm with the right kind of people, and that show through the visual, a sort of foregrounding of the visual, which is very prevalent throughout Western culture, that this is what I'm wearing, this is how I look, etc. So I think these are all new phenomena, but that they do continue a trend that Foucault is one of many critical thinkers to have examined. This trend that, I think Hegel said something like, modernity is entirely about subjectivity. So in other words, what matters in modernity is the subject and the subjectivity of the subject. And then of course you have many thinkers who point to the way in which the public sphere is increasingly impoverished and diminished, and all that matters is privacy and private life, and private fulfillment. And even at the economic level, the focus is that each individual should be free to provide their own economic security, should rely on, should not rely on social forces, social services, should be entirely an autonomous private entity that is precisely free, because that self is free from government, free from other people, free from the constraints of tradition or heritage or relationship. That more and more this complete focus on the value of the subject as the entire value of life, and the value of me being me is the sole yardstick by which we measure whether the world is good or not, whether it needs to be changed or not. That this is becoming increasingly universalized, that the private reality of the self is, and I think there are complex reasons for that include the fact that increasingly people are living with nothing that is sustaining other than their relation to themselves. So social relations are often fraught. Domestic life has tremendous pressures placed upon it because of how it's privatized in some ways and not given much social support. I mean, that might be more extreme in the US than other places. But at any rate, we see that people are affirming the self, and in part, it's the only thing left for them to affirm. Even if you look at the shifts in the economy with neoliberalism, the rise of the gig economy, that people have no sense of certainty about where their wage will come from, the decline of unions, the decline of tenured positions in higher education, the decline of careers, really. Like, we have a whole younger generation that instead of thinking, well, what am I interested in? And then I'll get work in that area and I'll shift jobs. I might be promoted. I might move around, but I know my interest is fashion, or I know my interest is education, or I know my interest is filmmaking or something. I mean, all of these are also, difficult to get a foothold in, but nevertheless, there were spaces where one entered a social world that allowed one to move in that as their occupational space or as their career space, and to make a living there. With the shift to a gig economy, which basically is an economy based on the impoverishment of worker rights, the eradication of collective bargaining, the reduction of labor costs within institutions across the board, so that labor as flexible labor is less of a fixed cost. That young people can no longer say that through my work I will find fulfillment. That's increasingly absent as a possibility. And also the other side of that is the further monetization, it's called, but it really a kind of further commodification of existence, that whatever I actually have that I can monetize, that's what I need to monetize. So maybe I have a car, so I can now be someone who drives a car for Uber or for Lyft, and I'm an independent contractor, and California is trying to say, no, you should be someone considered an employee with rights, and that there's a big political issue about that now for the next ballot. But at any rate, if you can monetize yourself through a website where people can watch you just going about your everyday life, then you monetize that. If your ideas about what's cool can get you monetized, then you become an influencer, and you're somebody who can make a living as an influencer. Because you gather followers, and followers are monetization. Likes, you gather likes are monetization. So this both individualizes what economic activity is. There's no social support outside of you to figure out how you will, in fact, pay your bills and make a living. And what you most have to monetize is, again, simply you as a self, as someone with taste, as someone with a certain look, as someone who has a car, or who has a house that you can rent from, these Airbnb type things. So we've sort of eviscerated the social structure of support for an entire generation, in part by also increasing the debt that people have when they come out of education. So that's another way of eviscerating their life prospects, because they can't simply enter into, there's no career to enter into, and they're already in debt. So they then organize themselves around different aspirations. It's not about the traditional buying a home and starting a family, or starting a family and buying a home, or whatever. It's now just about survival, but survival through a kind of individualized entrepreneurial spirit. And that's what everyone is left with. So obviously, for many people, their options are not to actually monetize their opinions or become an influencer or whatnot. It's to do the service work that can also include this monetization of owning a car, or even people who then rent out rooms that they have to monetize the fact that they rent an apartment, and that's an asset they have. What asset do they have? They have a lease on an apartment. So we've eviscerated these social support networks and thrown people back upon themselves as the only thing that they have. And of course, they also have families that they can go move in with their parents if things get difficult. If they're of a certain class, others have family support networks, but who are also living at levels of great poverty. So the self is all that we've left for people to have. And instead of saying that's not okay, we deserve more than ourselves to navigate the world. We deserve networks of support. We deserve free education. We deserve, in this country, free healthcare. We deserve, free meaning we'll work. We'll have jobs that hopefully we find somewhat interesting and that are socially valuable. We certainly know with proposals around the Green New Deal with that there are lots of jobs that could be socially rewarding, ecologically restorative, etc., instead of just how people can fill void with consumption of more goods. But this falling back on the self, there are multiple social forces creating that, and those who can simply embrace it and defend it as how they will get by, even as they understand that the world is not set up to support them very much, that there's very little that they can do to have a world. And then you throw the pandemic and you throw climate change on that, and you look at what this a current generation that's maybe 20 years old has gone through. They've gone through, out of the womb, they've gone through terrorist attacks that changed global geopolitical relations. They've gone through 2 or 3 crises of capitalism, where the economy has imploded. They've gone through unprecedented climate change. They've gone through these neoliberal reforms that have increased the price of education. Higher education, have increased disparity in education, have undermined work structures that provide actual careers. And so when they defend themselves, when they defend their identities, when they defend the purity of the truths that support their identities or that emerge from their identities, in a way they're defending the only turf that they have left. And so I understand that, but at the same time, what we need to do is think critically about the world that produced that tiny little narrow corner that we're now backed up against, and ask, how do we end up in this tiny space? And instead of simply trying to navigate it, what needs to happen for us to break it apart, for us to expand the spaces where we can actually be part of communities that are impacting policy, impacting cultural practice, creating creating possibilities that do not reproduce the tremendous inequities, the impoverished social sphere, what have you. So, I mean, identity through social media, I think, is another chapter to be written about the predominance of privatized subjectivity in really a kind of utopia that political liberalism produced. You know, that there is a private self, and that private self is what is most important, and the public realm should not impede the progress of that private self toward life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And in that, this is the liberal view of freedom as freedom from tyranny, from government, from others, from everything, from tradition. And within that, many thinkers, including thinkers like Hannah Arendt and Foucault, I think, operates with this assumption. What gets negated, or what gets devalued, is freedom to shape the world with others, freedom to be members of a political community, freedom to participate in a democracy. And that freedom to actually shape a world is undermined by the dominant notions of self that, again, continually tell us that the freedom that we want is private freedom. Raymond Williams has done this marvelous dictionary called Key Words, and the word private is a very interesting word in his dictionary. It comes from the Latin privare, which is closer to the English of privation or deprived. So in other words, private was a highly negative thing in Greek antiquity. Private life was the life of an idiot, the life of someone who didn't have access to the rich world of the public realm, of politics, of being free through interacting with others to shape the world. So private went from this highly disparaged and devalued term to something that now symbolizes status and exclusivity. You know, private property, private club, private life. I mean, the goal is to have those things, to have private property and to get into private clubs and to have a rich private life. And Foucault also speaks to, shifts therefore in masturbation. For the Greeks, the free Greek male citizen, masturbation was something for the impoverished, for someone who didn't have a spouse, have slaves, maybe they boys or girls, male or female, didn't have access to others for sexual pleasure. You only had access to yourself, so you were an impoverished kind of human being. Now, for us, masturbation is key to what it is to be a sexually liberated person. We discover the truth of our sexuality through masturbation, and then we communicate that to a partner. So even sexual liberation, at least in a certain mainstream sexological discourses, is really just me knowing the truth of my sexuality, and in its form as pleasure, I learned that truth through masturbation. And then what does my partner need to know? My partner needs to know that truth of my pleasure to be able to do as well as I do it through masturbation. So it's sort of a sexual pleasure in a relationship is surrogate masturbation, as opposed to, well, if you enter into a relationship, there should perhaps be mystery. We should perhaps learn something about ourselves, including our pleasure, that we didn't know before the relationship. So, this is 1 plus 1 doesn't need to only equal 2. 1 plus 1 ought to equal greater than 2, because there's the person and their history and their reality with another person with their history and their reality. And in that interaction, something else should emerge that is not simply the addition of one enclosed, self-enclosed entity and another self-enclosed entity. There should be an excess. There should be the trace of a difference that's not reducible to either person A or person B, but something that emerges. And of course, we have problematics there as well, in therapeutic discourses in California that are quite prevalent. The relationship becomes an object that itself has a life of its own, that is no longer, we're experimenting with how to bring joy into our lives together, or how to understand each other more deeply, or how to share our lives in ways that are meaningful. Instead, the relationship becomes a kind of reified object. If we can understand that, then we can become happy people within that relationship. So, but anyway, these are just ways of acknowledging the tremendous questions and problematics that Foucault opens up, even where he himself is not around to respond to, say, social media. But he was around to respond to shifts in subjectivity, and the history of subjectivity was one of his areas of work, and that subjectivity is something with a history, that we are not just unchanging selves that either are aligned with ourselves or not. We are shaped through history, through power dynamics, through cultural realities, and for Foucault, we have the agency in response. For Foucault, we're always already embedded in a world. We're not able to ever say, here's the self apart from a world, because we are always, as human beings, social beings. But we are able to be active in developing practices of self, what he called techniques of self. We can say, okay, I've been socialized to think X, or truth that's dominant has emphasized this, but in fact, that's convention. I can try other things, and I can actually only try them in ways that are powerful if there are social movements that are in existence, if there are cultural worlds in existence that enable those experiments.
Yes, that's something I was waiting to point. How can we think of, because we live in this dominant culture where thinking is reified, thinking is made into a product, or thinking is made into a theory that's static and everything. But Foucault's work points to, even in his later works, together with the history of sexuality, he was looking to the cynics, to Parrhesia, to a kind of thought that is always already linked to a way of life. So where thought needs to link to ways of life, to community, to practices, and that's what you're pointing to. And it's really hard when we live in a world today where subjectivity is reified as an object, as a thing, as the origin of history, or truth residing inside the self, in the interiority of the self is the origin of history. All of that is so dominant, and it becomes really, really hard to think of philosophy or of knowledges or of difference in relation to practices that try to experiment with new modes of life, or just opening up possibility for modes of life that are trying to make themselves, uh, uh, even remotely possible, because that's how I feel sometimes. I'm always looking to community, to alliances with communities and with different people that don't think the same as I do, or don't live the same as I do, just like my alliances with indigenous people here in Brazil and others that are very different. Even when we say indigenous people, it's so many different kinds of peoples and languages and beliefs and cultures and environments and ways of life. But I am not indigenous. I live in the city, and I try to make for myself here forms of community, but it's so hard to build something from the chaos of the many individual private selves trying to get by, within the truth of themselves that are asked by the market and by everybody else all the time. So you see the chaos I'm trying to think here. I wanted you, if you can please comment on this chaos, how to live with all this dominance and trying to align oneself with differences and trying to make also a life for yourself that can be meaningful. Because sometimes I feel like, what the hell am I doing? Am I doing enough with my life? Or I'm trying to live a different way of life that is meaningful to me, that makes sense. But all the time, of course, there are barriers, there are difficulties from many sides. And I'm not, of course, trying to build a model community or anything like that. I don't want to build a model anything. But at the same time, it's very, very difficult to see. It's not, I don't want to say the way out. There's no one way out, because there's no one problem, right? But how to build community within uh, within alliances that are so fraught with colonization, modes of thought that are dominant, that colonize everybody's minds and ways of life, in a way that when you say, okay, we need to rethink our ways of producing ourselves as subjects, and our production of knowledges, our production of ways of life need to be rethought, always rethought. And when you say ways of life, people are like, what's ways of life? Is that the food you choose to eat, the clothes you buy? And it's not that, of course. And then community has to come in. But community, as you're saying, is something that in this highly individualized culture has lost even the meaning. People don't know what that means anymore. Yeah, of course, I'm not talking about indigenous cultures here or other cultures that have a high sense of community. I'm talking about where I come from, the Western culture, Christian secular culture that I come from in Brazil, especially being a white Brazilian coming from the urban São Paulo metropolis that looks out into to the world, to other white Western Christian cultures for references, and never to indigenous cultures. I had to go after that myself, even though I have ancestry of indigenous people in my blood. It's all those breaks with tradition you're pointing to, and also the invisibility of possibilities. There are possibilities for constructing community, but people can't see them. Even when you point to people, sometimes they don't see what you mean when you say, let's rethink our modes of living, our ways of life. People tend to think of the private way of living again and again and again. How can we scarcely break that? How do you pointed to some things? You don't, of course, you won't have the answer. It's not that that I'm asking for, but
Well, for only this month, only for $9.95, I can sell you my How to Make Your Life Work Perfectly. It's
yes,
10 easy steps, and
yeah.
3 of them are animated for your viewing pleasure.
Yeah, there will be the self-help books all over, and self-help courses and videos online for everybody's needs, right, being sold, but they are for those very privatized and truth-centered and consumerist needs that you're pointing to, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, we're all limited by the historical moment in which we live. There are constraints and possibilities in any historic moment, but I was also fortunate to study with Herbert Marcuse as an undergraduate. He came out of retirement and gave a couple seminars at UC Santa Cruz when I was there. And I think one phrase of his that's as true today as it was when he wrote things like One Dimensional Man, he said, "We are living in counter-revolutionary times." So in counter-revolutionary times, strategies need to be different than they are in times where progressive forces are on the ascent. I mean, I think one of the dimensions of these counter-revolutionary times is that it is very polarized. And so there are progressive forces that are active and at work, but in a context where authoritarianism and anti-democratic practice and economic policy that disproportionately supports the very, very wealthy, uh, all of these forces are in ascendance. So that's what we're up against. In other words, I think part of what us looking for spaces of resistance or spaces of creative response is to understand that we can't do it. We can't do all that we want to do if the times are not permitting it, even as we can push up against those boundaries. But certainly, the forces that are even just undermining basic tenets of liberal democracy are very strong. So in a period of counter-revolution, where one might be critical of the limits of liberal democracy in a more open period of creative dissent, now I think part of what we need to do is simply safeguard democratic traditions. I mean, in the US, voter suppression efforts are off the charts. It's particularly trying to deny people of color, people with criminal records, people who are poor, people who often move or are homeless. There are students who are in the category of people who might not have a permanent address. There are all these efforts to try to undermine democratic processes, and that's and then there is resistance to that. So I think I can't offer anything more than to say we are in a period of tremendous reactivity and reaction. There is resistance happening on any issue we'd look at, whether it's indigenous cultural survival or indigenous language rights, which is something that I've been working on in Nepal recently, whether it's the ecological issues and the relation between the destruction of ecological diversity and the destruction of cultural and linguistic diversity. All those things are linked, and all those things also have to do with what knowledge counts, not only whose lives count, but also what knowledge counts. And if knowledge counts what do we need to do to safeguard the people who actually live by and try to live by that knowledge in the present. Issues of gender justice, of economic justice, of racial justice. I think all I can say is where there is resistance, and that resistance is often quite truncated. It's often also quite reactive in its organization and in its discourse. And yet we always start with what exists. And so whatever exists in sites that we're connected to, the question to me is, how do we bring intelligence to that? How do we bring thoughtfulness to that? How do we undermine reactivity by not continuing this process of bifurcation, I call it? Like in every movement you see, here are the good Muslims, here are the bad Muslims, here are the good queers, here are the bad queers, here are the good feminists, here are the bad feminists, here are the good white people, even in terms of dominant groups, here are the good white people, here are the bad white people. And this has been exacerbated as well by social media, where division and hate are now universally practiced as a kind of catharsis without value. In other words, they're thwarted attempts at catharsis. Let me feel better about myself because I found a person I can really attack. And in attacking them, I feel that I am pure. I feel that I am good. I feel that I've done something against the evil of the world. But we have to really, I think, double our resolve to not be reactive, to in whatever ways possible, when people are bifurcating within a movement or demonizing those outside the movement, we need to ask questions that foreground thoughtfulness, compassion, care, an understanding of the radical alterity that organize worlds. That people might want to say, oh, this person is, for this right-wing politician, so they're terrible people. I hate them. I have nothing in common with them. And instead, what are the conditions that produce each of us, and how are all of those conditions fractured? How are we all made vulnerable? How is it that, what are the structural forces that lead people to identify authoritarian leaders as the solution to their problems, even as those authoritarian leaders time and time again ignore their actual material and spiritual interests? That people still in this country who are unemployed white working class or underemployed white working class still somehow think that Trump might be the way to go or is the way to go unrelentingly. That points to other problems, with the degree to which people live in isolated and segregated worlds, the poor quality of education that is at the basic level and that is so linked to a ridiculous system for funding public education in terms of K through 12, which is based on property taxes, which means that if you live in a wealthy neighborhood, you get a good education, and if you don't, you get a bad education. All of the ways that public education has been undermined in the name of choice, here are other options. And this is not even to be critical of people who try to put their children in those schools, because they have a very concrete, immediate problem. How do I make sure my child isn't given a substandard education? So if there's an affordable private school or a charter school, which is actually a public school, but takes funds from public schools to support that charter school as a public school, so it's another way that both public school education is undermined, while people who are tired of waiting for a public system to actually meet the needs of their children have this option. So again, entering into complexity and multiplicity instead of moral purity as the grounds, if you will, a ground that's a mobile, unstable ground, but that how do we foreground complexity and multiplicity in understanding the world we're in, How do we foreground thoughtfulness and care in our responses to it? How do we, with others, undo our own reactivity? You know, if we're in a group that finds it very, or attempts catharsis through demonizing group X or Y, how do we say, what else can we say about ourselves, and what else can we say about group X or Y that breaks this bifurcation, breaks this demonization? Or if, you know, we had examples in things like marriage equality movement. If people who want to say, oh, I'm not for any heteronormative institutions like marriage, why is it that gay, lesbian, etc. people now want that? They're not radical enough. They're just being assimilated and being co-opted. How to support that and raise issues of other ways that people should be able to live and be affirmed and have the same economic benefits and have the same legal rights to visit someone in a hospital or to to have them inherit your property or whatever it may be. How can we have those conversations of expanding what's included in legal rights, economic rights, instead of bifurcating within an already vulnerable movement, LGBTQIQ movements, or feminists that have children and feminists who don't have children? Should that really be an issue of tension? You know, it's like, how do we make a world so that all children get what they need, both from their parents and from larger social worlds? And how do people who don't have children contribute to that? And how should we contribute to that? I just think there are so many issues that so immediately become organized in a moral binary. And in the process of that, we lose the space for learning. We also lose the space for alliance building. And if there's anything that I think I would foreground, it's how do we create social movements as spaces of learning so that it's exciting to be there. It's exciting to be there not because the fixed identity that I have now decided I am gets reaffirmed, but it's exciting to be there because I keep learning. I enter into conversations I never thought I would enter into. I meet people I never thought I would meet. Your description of working with indigenous people is moving into spaces of radical alterity, moving into spaces where you have a commitment to justice, you have a commitment to learning, and that's all you need to be a good ally. And that's all they need of you for you to be a good ally. And what they need is to also embrace that allies are necessary in any struggle. And instead of saying, oh, we're just through with white Brazilians from urban environments, they've screwed us over too many times, we don't want anything to do with them. Okay, yes, I'm sure that there is a long history of missing, even with good intentions, quote unquote. But there also is a need for communities who are under siege to understand that social change always requires alliances. And however it is that mutually beneficial relations can be created between particular communities that are subjugated and allies who are committed to their struggles and who can contribute to their struggles, those things need to be worked out. And in part, they can only be worked out if we try to facilitate our ability to learn together, to think critically together, to think strategically together, to challenge our own reactivity in ways that are not castigating of people or punitive, but instead say, here are dynamics that we're mired within. How within our movement, how within our community do we affirmatively address where we hurt each other, where we get stuck, and how do we do that in a way that moves us forward in terms of our social and political and economic aspirations, not just moves us forward in terms of how we feel about ourselves. And those are difficult things to do. But I think if we identify that are often stuck in ways of interacting, ways of mobilizing ourselves and others that are punitive, that are normalizing, that if you think like me, then I can work with you. If you don't, then I don't want anything to do with you. If you look like me, if you share my identities, then maybe some trust can exist. But if not, you just if you do show up, you better show up, but you better shut up and you better listen. Now, obviously, listening is key to any learning activity, but no one should be asked to only participate silently. And I think that's another dynamic we're seeing now in this society is, it's great that the racial justice demonstrations have been multiracial, multi-age, multi-gender, multi-class, etc. And then it's okay to have the concern of we need to make sure that people who are targeted continue to hold leadership positions, continue to be listened to. But we also want people who have expertise because of who they are and where they come from, that allow them to participate with everything that they have to bring. And we also need to not be punitive in relation to people who are who make mistakes or who offend. That we need to build the strength in communities and in ourselves to be able to say, I found that offensive, and here's why, and here's what I would need here's what I would like you to think about, or here's what I would like our community to be reflective on in moving forward. As opposed to, demonizing people or canceling people or doing all the things that are increasingly popular when moral purity, some fictive notion of a moral purity in which I reside, if that is violated by someone else, then they need to be exiled, which is, of course, a very violent act to take someone's world away from them for no other reason than that you feel injured, and this is now a legitimate reason for extricating people from a social space, is that they made somebody feel uncomfortable. And it's not even that they did something personal. There was a Harvard administrator who is a lawyer, African-American man, and he defended, as a lawyer, he defends people who are reprehensible. And students wanted him fired because he represented reprehensible people. And he said, I hope you will take time to learn about our justice system, where everyone needs to be presumed innocent until proven guilty, and that everyone deserves a quality lawyer, and that rarely happens, but because of my commitments to seeing everyone get decent representation, I do what I do. And Harvard, of course, didn't fire him, but he did move from his administrative position to just a faculty position. So you have various examples of an injury that isn't even a personal injury. Or in a local high school in San Francisco, there were work project administration during the Depression, these art projects that were supported by the government, and many people of very progressive politics at that time, communists and socialists, were involved in doing art that was, supportive of progressive struggle. There's a high school that said, well, the way that they depict, there's a Native American that's being violently, killed or injured by a colonizer. And this was an anti-colonial mural, but that was showing some of the violence that occurs through genocide and through colonization. They've decided to wash over that mural because students who are Native American or of color were assumed to be injured by that representation. Now, there's a teacher at that school that had students write essays, and the vast majority of students said we should learn from our history and not try to eradicate it. And the mural is a way of learning, and it was put up by people who wanted us to learn from it. It wasn't like the way Confederate monuments were put up to try to tell Black people, years after Reconstruction, that they should stay in their place, and that you will always be second-class citizens in the South. It wasn't that history, it was a different history. So how do you pay attention to history? How do you pay attention to how we can keep learning rather than how we can keep punishing and keep demonizing? And those are great challenges, because most people don't experience, whether it's in family, community, formal education, most people don't actually experience forms of education that they find exciting. Much of the education they experience is either rote learning or ranking. So maybe it's creative education, but only for those who've ranked high enough to get to the creative stuff. Others don't get to do that. All the various ways that education facilitates becoming smaller, becoming less confident, becoming more reactive, becoming someone less capable of interacting with others through relational skills, through cognitive skills, through effective emotional skills, through strategic thinking skills. We're not, through imaginative skills, we're not developing those things. And then we're wondering why it is that we're actually undermining the nurturing of capacities in people. And then we're wondering why people behave so horribly toward each other. We're abdicating our responsibility to young people by throwing technology at them and say, go ahead, make a world for yourselves online. And that's what we've given you. And so that's what young people do. And they do all sorts of creative and interesting things in the worlds online. They also live with more loneliness. A recent poll, the younger you are in this country, the lonelier you are. Literally down the line. If you're over 65, you have a richer social world than if you're between 55 and 64. If you're between 40 and 54, you have a richer social world than the people below you in age, but not the people above you, all the way down to the loneliest people in our society are the youngest generation. Because we've destroyed the social world in which they could actually form meaningful relationships. We've destroyed the capacity building, or we've undermined the capacity building to actually become human beings who can exist with diverse people, and not just I'm this identity and you're that identity, and we're both the right kinds of good identities, so we can support each other. But I also know that I can't say anything to you about you because I don't know you, and you can't say anything to me about me because you don't know me. I mean, we create these impossible situations that separate people in the name of purity, of moral purity, separate people in the name of truth. The definitions now of cultural appropriation are often shocking to someone who's an anthropologist. Any relation to anything that isn't oneself in a narrowly defined way, the self as, in fact, an identity and a unity, not as a multiplicity with complexities within it. If you interact with anything that isn't in line with your identity, somehow you're involved in a violent act of appropriation. It becomes impossible for people to actually do the work of building relationships that are required to be political allies, to be allies in community, to be struggling with issues in ways that, I say struggle, but in ways that involve joy, involve learning, involve connecting to people, not posting something and getting a like as a connection. That to me is a truncated connection that we've told young people you should learn to be happy with that. Not only learn to be happy with that, you should learn to focus on that as the raison d'etre of your existence. But what existence is that? We've taken away their world, and then we get upset if they're not behaving in the ways we'd like them to. But what we need to do is try to restore those worlds, and that's through these movements that are looking to create equity around education, around economic opportunity, but also to shift what economic activity is and does. How can economic activity be green activity? How do we not say there's, how is it that we allow a corporation not only to continue to exist, but to continue to exist and not pay taxes when its sole goal is to make profit and increase shareholder value? Not at all do anything for the communities around it, not do anything for the environment unless their PR wing decides that's good for our corporate image, that's good for our brand, so we'll do it. And we've even had business associations in the US come out and say this shareholder-only approach has failed. We need to go back to an earlier model where business thought that what mattered was providing good paying jobs so that workers could have good lives, so that communities could be strong. And of course, not simply a going back, because it shouldn't involve the gender inequity or the racial inequity that those days had, but that companies need to also have a public interest, have an environmental interest, have a social justice interest. So in every sphere, there are movements happening. I'm more connected now to the tech sector and through recent work. And in every sector, there are tremendous changes that are needed. There are ways that whole worlds are excluded from conversation, and that hype becomes the main way to build yourself up. Let's just talk about how great we are, even as in the tech world that's becoming increasingly difficult, because we see how Facebook is often a force for undermining democracy and spreading misinformation and disinformation. We see how major companies are in the $1 trillion sphere and they're not paying taxes. So we see the lack of diversity in the tech sector in terms of who's welcomed there. We see the lack of community involvement in creating products and the lack of community assessment in assessing products. So we see a huge digital divide that is basically not addressed, because you can't address it if all you're concerned with is your bottom line market share and profit margins. So, but in every sphere, in that sphere as well, there are people who are saying, okay, how do we use tech to facilitate indigenous language survival? How do we use tech to circulate, to develop learning materials that are relevant to different cultural groups and that help their education be relevant, etc. So nothing is binary, nothing is simple. We are in a world that has never more needed us to be at our highest point of functioning as human beings. And we have multiple institutional forces that are at work to make sure we're functioning at the lowest levels that we possibly can function at. And the pandemic is kind of a metaphor for that. It's more than a metaphor, but it's also a metaphor for, if you've gotten to where you're able to survive as a privatized subject, that you have enough, you have a job that allows you to work from home, or you have savings, you have an apartment where you're not a necessary worker, but necessary workers risk their lives to bring you your food or to bring you a book or whatever it is you need, then you're the right kind of human being and you matter. But if you haven't done that, then you're going to get sick and you might die, or you might get sick and you might get sick and die. You might get sick and infect those who aren't necessary workers, but they're your family or they're your community. So it's made clear that just creating a world for a few is not going to work even for those few. It's going to work better than for those who aren't those few, but it's not working for now. It's not working for the future. And I've said, and I'm sure you have thought this, that the planet Earth will be fine without humans, but humans need planet Earth. So if we do want to persist on this planet, then we have to address all these issues, but each of us are finite and need to address them in the spaces where we are, with people where they are. But to do so, bringing capacity that often appears as otherworldly, appears as so absent from the world that we're living in, that we can feel like aliens, bringing something called compassion or critical thought or care for difference, or a refusal to punish and demonize people who disagree with us, a refusal to create enemies. We're in a world of enmity, where creating enemy is as important as creating identity. And that dynamic has to be broken. We cannot move forward if we continue to live in that cycle of pure identity, impure enemy. If you had asked me how to respond to problematic issues, 20 years ago, when I still thought we could build institutions where difference and thought and critique and care could thrive, I would have focused on how much value there is in building these institutions that give people a different space to be in, to learn in, to grow in, whether that's an institution of learning, whether that's a business, whether that's a community center, whatever it may be, building these institutions. But now the forces to destroy that work are also stronger than ever. And the higher education is quite bereft at this moment. There's still amazing, there are amazing people, there's amazing work, there are amazing faculty members and students and staff members and administrators doing tremendously creative and valuable things. But it's within a context where the larger reality is that we find dangerous people who want to bring a difference to these times. And the marginalization and the demonization of people who seek to bring that difference is quite extensive. And yet people, as was famous when Elizabeth Warren said it, and yet she persists. And yet people persist. People persist in working with others, in bringing intelligent and caring conversations to sites that they're a part of. But all I can say is we've got our work cut out for us, because, again, these are counter-revolutionary times. These are times of the ascendance of reactivity, of authoritarianism, of isolation, of moral purity, of identitarianism. And those are all things that undermine thought, care, alliance, learning. And we need to figure out how to bring thought, care, alliance, learning, difference, possibility, relations to the impossible, relations to complexity and multiplicity. We need to do our best to bring those into whatever worlds we occupy and whatever worlds we have access to. So there's your non-answer.
That's great. Yes, maybe we can end here. I want to thank you so much. This was, for me, like going back to class with you again. So I didn't want to interfere too much. I just wanted to keep listening. I could, maybe if I had a snack, I could keep listening for another 2 hours.
I think we could both use a snack now, yes.
But thank you so much for being my professor again. And yes, and for giving me this great talk to my Critique with Nietzsche and Foucault channel, which is also your fault, because you gave me courses on Nietzsche and Foucault, and specifically also courses on Nietzsche and Foucault. thanks to you, my life changed so much that I now had to talk about this like almost every week and record videos and give classes. And, this is my life now. And we have to believe that we are making a difference, because I believe you made a difference in my life, and I know I have made a difference in so many other people also, and we must keep going. And yes, they are counter-revolutionary times for sure, but maybe it just makes it more fun too, and we must find that fun, otherwise we become reactive really easily. It's very easy to become reactive, and we must be attentive to that for sure. Thank you so much. Send my regards to Angana and everybody else in the around, and hope to see you soon again here.
Well, thank you. I have tremendous gratitude in my heart for you reaching out. And this to me was also a moment that was, I felt fully alive and present. And it was also a moment that did stir reminiscences of a shared past and of a wonderful community where learning and growth and caring and listening was so central to everyday life. And I am grateful for your words about what that meant to you and what role I was able to play. And I'm grateful to hear that you have continued to be alive to that and have passed it on and have given to others. And this is the work of learning and sharing. Sharing what we learn and continuing to learn through that sharing, and keeping that cycle alive. So I'm very grateful to you and very appreciative of all the work that you do, both with this podcast, but everything else you've done as a filmmaker, as an activist, as a writer. So thank you, Rodrigo. And perhaps we'll have to do this again.
Sure, that would be awesome. Thank
Wonderful.
you so much.
Be well, and I'll pass on your regards to Angana.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.
Okay. Take care, Rodrigo. Bye-bye.
Bye.